Hi, welcome to CCM's Earth Day event. Although Earth Day is on the 22nd, we're just going to be celebrating here today at this discussion. My name's Clara. I go by she, her. Kara, Emily, if either of you want to introduce yourself.
Okay, I can go ahead. My name's Emily, and I go by she and her. And yeah, I'm working with the social justice advocacy team.
And I'm Kara. I also use she, her pronouns, and I am the social justice and advocacy coordinator. I mean, the assistant here at CCM. Clara's our coordinator.
It's okay. Okay, so going in. So today we're going to be talking about Earth Day. We have a guest speaker lined up today, Dr. P, as the students call him. He'll be in later in this, but let's get into it now.
Okay, so what is Earth Day? So Earth Day is an annual event on April 22nd, and it demonstrates just basically support for environmental protection. So it's marked by more than 1 billion people around the world as a day to change human behavior that's harmful to the environment and to promote policies that aim to protect the environment. Okay, so why is Earth Day important? It's important because, well, first of all, because it sends a clear message to world leaders to act on climate change and, like, once again, just to keep, like, policies that protect the environment as a first priority. And it inspires people to take action towards the protection of the environment and focus on the need for conservation. And lastly, it just educates people on what we've lost and what we're going to continue to lose if we don't start acting in ways that are environmentally friendly.
Okay, so how do we celebrate Earth Day? There's a lot of ways to celebrate Earth Day. I know last year, one of the big things for Earth Day celebration was planting a lot of trees. There was the Tree Quest event. 10 million trees were planted on Earth Day. It was a great thing, but you can also do that too. I don't know if Kara wants to show her little plant that she has herself, but Kara has a plant. It's perfectly great. Oh, you have it. Perfect. But like getting a plant to like try and like make your environment more green, or like tending to a garden is a really great way to get into Earth Day. Also donating to environmental causes as well is a great way to do it. And being at events like this where you're learning more about environmental issues with climate change and pollution is another great way to get involved. Yeah.
So thank you both for that background on the history of Earth Day. And now I'm going to take a moment to honor how the values of Earth Day are in alignment with our values here at Depaul. So basically, why are we talking about this as Depaul students? So as members of the Depaul community, we should view Earth Day as an extension of our work. As student advocates, our work here is always grounded in the Vincentian mission. And the Vincentian mission is our commitment to justice that drives us to create a sustainable world. And Earth Day is an opportunity for our community to gather and carry out the Vincentian mission through discussions, through advocacy, through going outside and celebrating in multiple ways. And it also is in alignment with the Catholic social teaching pillar, care for God's creation. So in caring for the earth, we are fulfilling one of our duties as Vincentians. And now I'm going to talk a little bit about this term, intersectional environmentalism. And basically, this term means, like in all social causes, it is always essential to center the people who are disproportionately affected in the heart of a movement. And when it comes to climate change, I just want to recognize that it is necessary to acknowledge and advocate for those experiencing the harsh realities of climate change on the front lines. The fight for sustainability is a much needed one, and we need to acknowledge and mobilize in solidarity for our global neighbors. And as part of our work on the social justice and advocacy team, we are student representatives with the global nonprofit Catholic Relief Services. And a little bit about them and how they're connected to DePaul is they are a mission-driven organization that is dedicated to helping vulnerable populations create sustainable solutions to poverty on a global scale. So since Earth is our common home. This is clearly a global problem. And they use a similar framework as Depaul does to drive their purpose and measure their impact. And a reason why they make sure that they're talking about environmentalism is because climate change is disproportionately affected these vulnerable populations that they serve. And on Catholic Relief Service's website, as you can see on the screen, there's like little headlines. They have lots of informative stories that kind of paint the picture as to what's going on in these different communities. So, for example, in the case of Zimbabwe, droughts have economically destroyed these communities along with their food sources. And the lakes are running dry and crops are destroyed. So, this is just one of many, unfortunately, brief examples as to why it's important to center the needs of those most vulnerable of the climate crisis. So I encourage you all to read these stories as a way to celebrate and deepen your understanding of intersectional environmentalism. And it's a great way to continue the celebration of Earth Week. And if you follow us at CCM, Social Justice and Advocacy, we have a private Facebook group. One of the last slides has the name to our community written out there, but I will flag links to those if people are interested in learning about these global impacts of climate change.
So next we want to talk about some global environmental problems, and I have a video specifically talking about how COVID-19 has affected the environment. And yeah, let's get into it.
It's a scene we've all become familiar with no matter where in the world. Wearing a mask is our new normal. But while single-use protective gear might be saving lives, they're also polluting our environment.
During the pandemic, we have seen an increase in the usage of individual protective gear, such as face masks and gloves, very often made out of plastic.
The Italian Institute for Environmental Research found that in just 2 months of lockdown during March and April, the amount of general waste fell by 10%. That's 500,000 tons. Researchers also looked at the increased use of personal protective gear during this time.
We've studied 69 glove models and more than 30 face mask models, all very different from each other. They have different structures. Some have valves, some have filters, and therefore different weights. We made an assumption on the average weight, and we found out that at the end of 2020, this production will create 300,000 tons of additional waste. And that's just masks and gloves alone.
Researchers say that means the totals will balance each other out by the end of the year, and the amount of waste produced is likely to be similar to before the pandemic. Environmentalists are also concerned that the pandemic has rolled back global efforts to curb single-use plastic.
We have also seen an increase in consumption of packaged foods and e-commerce that uses a lot of single-use plastic packaging. We don't have an estimate yet of how much of those objects were dumped into the environment, but what is sure is that all of those that have been abandoned sooner or later will reach the sea.
The UN trade body UNCTAD estimates global mask sales have doubled since last year, with the trade worth $166 billion. Plastic pollution was already one of the greatest threats to our planet before the outbreak. And around 75% of used masks, as well as other pandemic-related waste, will end up in landfills or floating in the seas. Sara Khairat, Al Jazeera.
Okay, let me pause that. So in particular with that, I wanted to bring up okay, there we are. In particular, I wanted to bring up how they talked about the plastic waste and mass ending up in the ocean, because one of our threats that we're currently looking at right now is the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. I don't know if you know what it is. I really recommend that you look it up. It's fascinating, honestly, how it came up. But basically, because of how like the ocean currents work, 80,000 tons estimated of garbage is just accumulated in the ocean and is circling around. And there's also two of them that are happening basically. And this is happening also in other areas of the oceans as well, where just plastic is piling up and it's polluting the ocean. And with the things that are happening with recycling, only about, I want to say like I don't have the stat directly on me, but with how recycling is right now, all the waste that normally would go into being recycled isn't actually being recycled. Instead, it ends up in landfills and can end up in ocean and only harming us more. And due to this as well, in our oceans, in the land, and just birds as well in the air, roughly 200 species a day are going extinct. That's including plants, insects, fish, animals, just in general, are going extinct. And when we're looking at like natural areas like the Great Coral Reef, it's been shrinking for several years now. And then also when we're looking at even in our local community as well, several species have been going on the verge of extinct and needing government care because of what's going on. So now we want to bring on our guest speaker. We have Dr. P with us today, as his students call him. Can you tell us a little about yourself and your work to introduce us?
Yeah, great. Oh, excuse me. Yes, I'm Mark Potosnak. I'm both the chair and an associate professor in environmental science and studies. I've been at Depaul, I think this is the end of, or getting towards the end of my 13th year. So I think for a faculty member, that's sort of like middle-aged. There's certainly quite a few people that have been here for quite a lot longer than I have. Within the department, I do get to teach right now. I'm teaching appropriately global climate change. I've been teaching that class, I think, almost the whole time I've been here. I teach some other very interesting, or at least they're interesting to me, classes, Earth System Science, which talks both about natural systems, but with definitely a very with a big focus on how humans are perturbing those natural systems. I get to teach some other neat classes too, like research methods, and I do a lot of work overall with students, which both obviously in classes, but I also work with students on various research projects, and a couple of them I just wrapped up. One very relevant to COVID. We had one of my undergraduate students looked at air quality during the COVID pandemic, and interestingly, unlike some other parts of the world, in Chicago, air quality didn't improve that much here. So that's what we're kind of teasing that one apart.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. Sorry, this is actually going to be a question you didn't prepare for, but I love that you teach a global climate class. Could you go more into that, please?
Sure. I teach it almost, I think lately about twice a year, two different quarters a year. I'm teaching it now. I'll teach it again in the fall. It is it's a neat class because I have two groups of students. Some students are taking it for their scientific inquiry credit as part of that learning domain, scientific inquiry. So you can get it. So that's one way. And so I have students from all across the university, of course, probably any. My guess is most of you have to take a scientific inquiry class. And then also I teach it for undergraduates that are environmental studies majors. So it's usually about, roughly about a third majors, 2/3 from around the university. It's really neat because the majors bring in some specific environmental knowledge that like they might know about ecological restoration. But then you'll pair them up with like a student from education or a student from accountancy. And then everything is getting impacted by global climate change. And all these different fields have to be part of the solution. So students, I teach the science of climate change. I'll go through the greenhouse effect, climate models, all the nitty gritty science, but I really ask students to bring in the solutions. So looking at alternative energy, consumerism, well, limiting consumerism is the solution there. So it's a great mix, and I've really enjoyed teaching it over the years. Right now, I'm teaching it to I think about 7 to 8 students are coming in person, and the rest are online. But in the fall, I'm scheduled to be back to in person. We usually meet in person once a week with again all that like kind of science content I deliver online. I figure I don't need to do the greenhouse effect year after year. Nothing changes. So we spend the interactive time talking about solutions where there's new stuff all the time. Every year I learn from the students about new solutions or new wrinkles in existing solutions for climate change.
Thanks for that then. Kara, did you want to start asking your questions you had prepared then?
Yeah, of course. So thanks for touching on your work and involvement within the department now. And I guess a question that we had for you is, how did you get into doing environmental work at DePaul? What's a little bit about your journey to getting your doctorate like, or just what drew you to the field in general?
Sure, that's a great question. I mean, I didn't start college wanting in environmental science. I started college in physics, and actually, most of my like high school life, I assumed I was going to be an engineer. I come from a family of engineers. My mother's father was like, he was literally an engineer. He built trains and was, really an engineer. My uncle on my mother's side was an engineer. My mother was a math teacher, so technically not an engineer, but very analytical. So I had this really background of engineers, and I thought I'd do that. And I decided engineering was just a little bit too like in the box for me. I didn't. So I got to college, and I decided I wanted to major in physics. I thought physics was so interesting, like learning about how things moved around, how equations could predict a reality. But my first year at school, I took a class on atmospheric science. And atmospheric science was all still about physics, but it was applied. And this was quite some time ago, about 30 years ago. So we were talking about the ozone hole. Scientists were just learning about it's both physics and chemistry. And when I saw like all this elegant and exciting science applied to a problem of societal relevance, I was like totally hooked. And then I had my first professor, he got me an opportunity to do the clincher was working outside. I did a lot of field work, and so my first summer after my first year of college, I went out to a forest and did started doing measurements, and I've been doing field work. I try and do field work all the time. I don't always get as much of a chance as I used to, but so I think I really like the intersection between science and application, and environmental science is just where things get put together. Maybe I can't remember this. I think is a good time to touch on it too. I think what's also from a Catholic campus ministry point of view, which is interesting, is I was born and raised Catholic, and I wasn't and it was just there. And then I was an environmentalist and an environmental scientist, and that was on this side. Until I got to DePaul, it never occurred to me to put these two together. They were just like separate boxes. It was like going to church was over here, being, studying environmental science and being concerned about the environment was over here. I never saw any connection to them. So I was truly fortunate to end up at DePaul and get some really good synthesis, and then I actually started working, volunteering on some of these efforts. And then when the Pope's encyclical came out on the environment about 5 or 6 years ago, it was just great because it was something I could just dive into.
Perfect. I know that working at DePaul now, you're working on are you working on any initiatives or projects in and around DePaul or Chicago? Currently?
I do a couple different things. I'm a member. We just met. Yesterday morning. I can't even remember. I think we just met yesterday morning. I'm a member of the Cook County Environmental Commission, so I'm technically a political appointee for Cook County. I don't get paid, so I guess there's not a lot of gravitas that comes with it. But we're advising the Cook County on various environmental issues. So we picked 3 to work on. One was that you've mentioned, planting trees. A second one is interesting. It's the so-called weed ordinance. We really encourage, particularly some of my colleagues at the Field Museum, encourage native plantings. So say you have your yard, tear out some grass and put in some native plantings. Unfortunately, if you do that in the city of Chicago, you risk getting a ticket from the city because they have an ordinance that grass can only be so high. And even though it's a native prairie, they consider it weeds. And so you could get a fine from the city. So we're working to change that ordinance. And then finally, I'm working on industrial composting. So we often think about composting at like the, you could compost and in your backyard compost. This is like, for example, Depaul, and we're good. Depaul does compost. Chartwell's our food contractor under normal circumstances has a composting program. So Cook County is exploring ways to encourage more places with food service, and particularly the county has a lot of like hospitals and things like that, so that they could have either on-site composting or work with a contractor to get their food waste composted. So that I work with the Cook County. And yeah, I mean, another effort is working here locally with the Archdiocese of Chicago on their with what we call the encyclical working group. So just advancing Laudato Si, the Pope's encyclical on the environment, but just more generally getting people to see the connection between the environment and their faith. That thing I was talking about, letting parishioners in Chicago see that same thing.
Is there any way people would be able to volunteer with helping either the Archdiocese with their environmental programs, or I mentioned the Field Museum you said has like their program of trying to plant more native plants. Is there any way people can volunteer to be a part of that?
Yeah, I think in both cases, yes. I mean, the Archdiocese, they're always looking for help. So I'm sure the encyclical working group, we have a couple grad students in environmental science have worked for us. So that we definitely have had that in the past. We've also had volunteers through the Stain Center for Community Engagement. I'm sure, I don't know if you've heard about the Stain Center, but maybe some of you have. And we have students through them. The Field Museum has a pretty well-established volunteer program. They also have a lot of information online because unfortunately, a lot of the volunteering is all virtual right now, right? It's not as much in-person work going on. But the Field Museum has a lot of information about how you can do native plantings and how you can promote the monarch butterfly. And then we have a student, again, another grad student in my program, but the Field Museum is also pushing the rusty patch bumblebee. So we've all heard about the monarch, and hopefully you've heard about, well, you know, the monarch. And then milkweed is what you plant for the monarch. So there's some similar, but other habitat you can make for other types of insects, other pollinators. It's not just the monarch. We're trying to open it up and support other endangered insects.
I know, Kara, you had particularly one funny question you wanted to ask Mark.
Oh yeah, the question you're referring to is: are there any environmental conscious myths that you hear and just kind of cringe at? Like, what are the big false narratives or myths that this helps save the world and this doesn't? Like, I know that's very vague, but if you could speak to anything, that would be really great.
Okay, so I mean, the first, it's not really a myth; it's just a misconception. I mentioned the ozone hole, and so a lot of people think, and if you don't think this, I hope I'm not causing a bad association here, but a lot of people think that the ozone hole, there's an ozone hole letting in sunlight that is the ozone hole lets in sunlight, and that's causing global warming. No, the ozone hole is completely different. Global warming is a different problem. They have some subtle interactions, but the ozone hole is not causing global warming. They're completely different. So that's a common misconception. I when I teach, I always have to straighten that out. You know, there are probably some like flat out myths, but I think there's also hold on a second. Is that about Tootsie Rolls? Oh, okay, yes. Sorry, my 9-year-old wants to go outside and play, even though it's 7:30 at night. So I think more, you know, there are environmental myths, but I also think people kind of, you know, get things out of proportion. And I think some of this is like an ability to control what you can control. So, for example, recycling. I mean, recycling does help. You know, it takes energy to make aluminum. And so throwing out an aluminum can is bad, and recycling it does help. But it's not going to save us. So great, recycling is a nice start. I'm not saying we should stop recycling, but there's some types of recycling, like paper recycling. It's unclear how much of a benefit recycling, especially mixed paper, how much of a benefit that has. It's not so much a myth, but I think people get focused on these, I hate to call them small things, and then miss some of the bigger picture. So I think recycling is one of those myths. Others, I'm trying to remember right off the top of my head. You know, in plastics, understanding the links between climate change and plastics. because there are some trade-offs. If you know, I mean, plastic water bottles are bad. We shouldn't use plastic water bottles. We should use reusable water bottles. But if you're going to have a drink and you switch from plastic to glass, yeah, well, I mean, the glass is very heavy, and so there's a climate cost associated with that drink getting produced somewhere and traveling all over the United States before you drink it. So it's unclear whether, you know, from switching from plastic to glass, you've made a huge improvement. If you don't drink the drink, if you just go to the water fountain and chug down water, much better, right? So I think those are a couple. Straws are bad, but they're not, you know, giving up straws is not going to save the world in terms of climate change. Now, I think that's the other thing too that I focus in my class. There's, you know, this is Earth Day, so we're talking about environmental issues generally, and I get a little bit laser focused on climate change, which of course there's other issues besides climate change, although a lot of them are linked together. So, you know, plastic waste ending up in the ocean is a bad problem. But we also have to, you know, it's not a climate problem per se, it's an environmental problem. But sometimes I get a little overexcited with my students when I go, okay, we're only going to talk about climate change, not just everything that's bad about the environment. We're going to drill in. And so, and be very focused on one issue instead of just the whole big picture. So those are a couple of my, I don't know, myths. They're not quite myths, but just kind of like, you know, we're kind of not judging the relative merits of different things.
Another one of those that I hear a lot is like eating a plant-based diet or going vegetarian. I'm just interested to hear your thoughts on that, because I know that meat production is a big, like cows are a big methane emitter. So I'm not sure if the connection there is limited to that or what people are talking about when they say things like that.
Yeah. That's a really interesting one. So there definitely that, I mean, it's definitely not a myth. I mean, certainly eating meat has a higher impact, and particularly red meat from cows. It's a less of an impact when you go to chickens, because chickens don't, they don't do that methane production. Cows do it, chickens don't. So there's definitely, it's definitely not a myth. Interesting thing, sometimes you hear different numbers, and some people will say agriculture is responsible for 25% of global greenhouse gas emissions, and that maybe is about right. Interestingly, here in the United States, here's the issue. Do we eat more red meat than most parts of the world? Yes. But we do so many other things in excess. We travel so much. We have so much transportation emissions, construction emissions, that even though, yes, you can only eat so much more, but you can kind of consume even more, so that agricultural emissions are a smaller piece of the pie in here in the United States. So, I mean, I don't want to let us off the hook because it's still too much. But if we only focus on agriculture here in the United States, we're going to miss huge chunks of emissions. Does that make sense? So, like, our emissions pie is bigger, which, you know, bad analogy because we all like pie, but this is a bad pie of emissions. So the relative size of the agricultural piece, the whole piece is bigger than someone else's piece from say sub-Saharan Africa, but our pie is so large that if all we worry about is the emissions, we still have this huge pie of emissions out there that we haven't touched. I should really stop the pie analogy because it just makes me, it's a bad thing, and pies are so nice.
I mean, everyone wants to make sure that they get their own slice of the pie, so maybe eating it away is the right option.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
I know that you mentioned that like recycling isn't going to like save the planet, and that we do need to focus on like those bigger things. Would you consider like that your analogy of like the pie then to be that like bigger idea, or was there more to it as well?
Yeah, I mean, you know, the big pieces of our pie, we have to worry about transportation emissions, and not just personal transportation, but the transportation used to move goods and services around the country, energy production. That's a big chunk of our emissions. We're still burning coal here in the United States to produce electricity. Most parts of the world, certainly in Europe, have turned away from that, at least Western Europe. There's still places in Eastern Europe that do it to some extent. So that's something we need to fix, and really should have been fixed a while ago. We still are going to produce electricity through natural gas. We got to start minimizing that at this point, but we got to eliminate coal, reduce natural gas. So that means we got to do a lot more wind and solar. And we know how to do it. It's just a matter of funding, putting more money in upfront into it to get that long-term payoff. It's not even, we'll make money long-term. It's not even a dollars and cents problem. We just need to make the investment sooner than later. So wind and solar on wind and solar. So we need to do those. But usually, that's the thing about focusing on any one piece. When you talk to climate scientists and to social scientists that look at like the big picture, we got to do everything. And it's because there's so many pieces out there. It is it's been described as a wicked hard problem. I'm not a fatalist. I think we can make progress on this. I don't think solving it is really in the cards, but I think, ameliorating it and working on it can definitely happen and make the future much better. But we have to, when I have the students look at their solution projects, it's not just one, it's not ABC, pick one. It's A, B, and C. We got to work on all these. We got to reduce consumption. We have to change diet. We have to change our generation of energy. We have to be more efficient. We have to think about transportation, electric cars. So it all plays together. I'm not trying to like cop out, but and I think that's why I think some people say, "Oh, I recycle," and then jump on a plane. And then we all like to jump on planes once in a while, but we got to minimize it and not do it all the time. So
with that, then we are at like 30-minute mark. Did Kara, Emily, did either of you have any more questions you want to ask? Or Mark, did you have any statements that you want to say?
I'll just finish up by saying, I teach a class in climate change. There's also a companion class usually taught by Dr. Hugh Bartling in public policy studies called Climate Change Policy. And honestly, there's a ton of courses that are relevant to climate change in both in the policy and on the science side. So there's plenty. There's classes. We have environmental literature classes. There's a lot of ways, especially through your learning domains, that you can get more and more information. Like the one thing I really try and drill home a lot of things in my class. The one thing I'm always trying to convince is that the science matters, right? It's not just, okay, this is bad, so let's stop doing it. You really need to, it's such a hard problem, you need to know the details. And knowing the details will help us come up with effective solutions that we can start doing right away. So that'll be my last little spiel.
Okay. Kara, I did see you unmuted your mic. Did you have one last thing?
I just was going to close off in the spirit of Earth Day and asking if you have any Earth Day traditions, or if there's any way you celebrate. I know the little cliche that every day is Earth Day and you should treat the earth with respect, and clearly this is your profession and something you engage with a lot, but I know we always hear, oh, it's Earth Day celebration, and I want to know if you actually do a specific Earth Day celebration.
That's a great thing. I don't, I got to admit, but I appreciate Earth Day because I often am asked to give talks to students, to others in the community. I'm doing another talk tomorrow night. I did one earlier in the month, and so I guess it's not quite a tradition, but getting out and being able to just chat with people and answer questions, I enjoy it. And I do think if it's not a tradition, it's at least something where I think, gets me re-engaged, right? Because it's good to see and hear the interest from other students and other people that just out in the general public.
Of course. Well, thanks for engaging with us.
All right, and that will be all for today. I'd like to thank everyone who came out to watch this. I'd like to thank Dr. P, of course, for coming out as well, and thank you.
Well, thanks for inviting me, and I really appreciate all your attention and all the work you do in terms of environmental, social justice, and advocacy.